All right, ladies and gentlemen, so in this video, we're going to cover the bony landmarks and the muscle attachments for the posterior thigh. Okay, so these are going to be your hip extensors and your knee flexors. All right, so this is your posterior view. That means that this out here is going to be lateral, and you can see the greater trochanter of the femur out here. And then we have this is the medial side right here, okay? And when we're looking at this posterior view, I just want to point out the fact that all these muscles we're going to look at, they're crossing posterior to the hip joint. Okay, so they're going to cause extension at the hip. And they're also, most of them, not all of them, are going to cross posterior to the knee joint to cause flexion at the knee. Okay, so most of them are going to cross the knee joint, and we're going to look at the few exceptions that do not. Okay, so first let's start with these bony landmarks. So we have over here the innominate bone. This superior portion of the innominate bone is known as the ilium. And this portion of the ilium right here, this very large crest, is known as the iliac crest. Okay, the iliac crest terminates anteriorly into a spine. This spine over here is known as the anterior superior iliac spine, right? Also known as you may see it shortened as ASIS, okay? So there's an anterior superior iliac spine, which is on the anterior termination of that iliac crest. In addition to that, we're also going to have the posterior termination of that crest right here. So this is going to be called the posterior superior iliac crest. Okay, that's your posterior superior iliac crest. And you may start to see a pattern here in terms of how this is named: anterior superior, posterior superior. There are two other spines. There's another one that's anterior, and there's another one that's posterior. But notice the difference between these two spines versus the counterparts up here. These are located inferior to these, right? These are the superior set, and this is the inferior set. So what are we going to call these? This one over here is going to, since it's anterior, right, it's going to be the anterior, but now it's going to be the inferior iliac spine, also known as the AIIS. Okay, then we're going to have over here the posterior inferior iliac spine. Okay, the posterior inferior iliac spine is right there. Okay, and that's the PIIS and the PSIS. Okay, the anterior superior iliac spine and the anterior inferior iliac spine are going to serve as attachment sites for some muscles that we're going to see on the anterior thigh. I just wanted to include them here so that you can see how they contrast with these posterior spines over here. Okay, and in addition, I just want to point out the fact that ASIS and the iliac crest are very important surface anatomy landmarks that we use in clinical medicine all the time. The iliac crest, for example, lines up with the vertebral level of L4, L5. So this is useful for finding the location site, let's say in the instance where you're going to do something like a spinal tap, okay? This iliac crest will show you the level at which you have to insert that needle to get that cerebral spinal fluid. All right, so we continue. And then over here we see some of this is review from the previous, from the gluteal region video up here. So let's review this real quick. So this right here, this whole part of the innominate bone that's facing most posteriorly is known as the ischium. Okay, and if you need a refresher on the innominate bone, I have another video that I'm going to link right here. So right here, we see that this is going to be this is the ischium, okay? This portion of the ischium right here is a spine that is sticking out. We're going to call this the ischial spine, okay? So that's the ischial spine right there. Okay, that's this point. The ischial spine and the posterior inferior iliac spine have this notch that exists between those two spines, right? That's known as the sciatic. That's known as the greater sciatic notch. Okay, so I'm going to put it right here. Greater sciatic notch. Okay. That's the greater sciatic notch. Likewise, we're going to have a smaller notch right here. Okay. That is going to be your, and that's what this line is indicating, that is going to be your lesser sciatic notch. Okay. That is your lesser sciatic notch. That's that guy. Okay. And then right here, this second line right underneath this one is pointing to this open space right here. This is a foramen. Okay. Remember, foramens are basically complete circles, okay, that allow the transmission of structures from one area to another. So this right here is known as the very important foramen. It's known as the obturator, obturator foramen. Okay, that's the obturator. That's the obturator foramen. Okay, that's that guy right there. So that's the obturator foramen. This right here is a rough patch of bone that is also on the ischium. And this rough patch of bone is what we sit on. Every time we're sitting on a seat or any surface, we're sitting on this. Okay, this is your ischial tuberosity. Okay, I'm gonna write it down here. Ischial tuberosity is that one. Okay. That's your ischial tuberosity. It's rough patch of bone. The ischial tuberosity we're going to see in a few minutes is going to serve as a common attachment site for most of the hamstrings of this posterior thigh compartment. Okay, most of them are going to be attaching here to form something that's known as a common hamstring tendon. Okay, all right. So now let's move on to the femur. So we're looking at the femur. The femur is going to have two trochanters. Okay, it's going to have one up here and then one down here. So this one up here is a larger one. We call it greater trochanter, and this one down here is a lesser trochanter. Okay, so I'm going to type that in for you. So over here we have the greater trochanter. All right. Let's open this up a bit. All right, that's the greater trochanter. And then down here, this guy, this is going to be our lesser trochanter. Okay, that's the lesser trochanter. In between the two trochanters, there's a line. There's like a raised part of that bone right there. We call it a crest. So this is a crest that is traveling between two trochanters. Therefore, we call it, I'll just add it right here to this text box. We call it the intertrochanteric crest. Okay, that's the intertrochanteric crest. Is that right there? Then we're going to have this little fossa that is on the inner side of this greater trochanter, on the medial side of it. Okay, it's like sitting right here. It's like this little pocket. Okay, where several of the external rotators of the hip, they insert on there, like the piriformis, the superior and inferior gemellus, obturator externus, yada yada. They're all inserting in there, and this is known as the trochanteric fossa. All right, that is your trochanteric fossa. Next, we're going to have this rough patch of bone over here that's going to serve as an attachment site for the gluteus maximus. This is going to be your gluteal tuberosity. Next, we have this right here. So, pointing at any typical bone, right? I would look at this and say, that this is the shaft of the femur, right? But one thing I want to point out is that on the shaft of the femur, particularly when we're looking at the posterior aspect of this femur, you can kind of make it out over here a little bit. Let me see if I could change this cursor so you can get a better view of what I'm talking about. So right there's a line right here. There's another line. Both these lines come from another line right there. Okay, and this line that we find on the posterior aspect of the femur is a rough line, and rough line is translated in Latin as linea aspera. Okay, linea aspera. So that rough line right there, the linea aspera, serves as an attachment site for many of the muscles that we're going to find in the posterior thigh and also from the medial compartment of the thigh. Okay, not just from the posterior thigh, also from the medial compartment. So very important attachment site. Okay, so this is our linea aspera. Okay, then we're going to have this surface right here. So it's very smooth surface right here that is forming the floor of what would be called the popliteal fossa. If we on the actual human body, right, not just on the bony skeleton, on the actual human body with all the soft tissue added to this, you would have a depression right here behind your knee. I mean, you could put your hand on it right now as you're listening to me talk. There's this shallow depression behind your knee that's called the popliteal fossa. This aspect of the femur right here is known as the popliteal surface. Okay, the popliteal surface. All right. Then we're going to look at these two aspects of the femur, right? And these are the two condyles of the femur. Okay, so this out here is going to be the lateral condyle of the femur, and this over here is going to be the medial condyle of the femur. Okay. Next we have down here. So just like in the forearm, where the forearm was created by a radius and an ulna, the leg down here, right? So this right here is the thigh. Okay, where the femur is the thigh. Down here past the knee, distal to the knee, is the leg. Okay, the whole thing is your lower extremity. So when we're looking at the upper extremity, we had your arm and then forearm, right? You had your arm that was just made by the humerus and then your forearm that was made by the radius and ulna. So over here we have the same situation again of two bones making up that distal aspect, or that more distal part of the extremity, right? So here we're going to have the tibia and the fibula, right? So this part of the fibula right here is known as the fibular head, right? The fibular head. Okay. Good. This is a good basis for us to go now into the muscles. All right. So first muscle we're going to talk about is the adductor magnus. The adductor magnus, and specifically I put in parentheses the hamstring part. So the adductor magnus, you can see from its name that it's a large muscle. Okay, it's a very large muscle. So large, in fact, that us anatomists have categorized it into two compartments at the same time. We say that it lives in both the medial compartment of the thigh and the posterior compartment of the thigh at the same time. Okay, being that it's a very large muscle, it has a very wide array of muscle fibers that are arranged in different directions, which allows this one muscle to effectively create multiple different angles of force, to create different movements depending on which part of the muscle is contracting or is being neurally stimulated. Okay, so the posterior, the part of the adductor magnus that sits in the posterior compartment of the thigh, we call the hamstring part, because it's going to act as the other hamstrings do, is specifically by causing extension at the hip. Okay, some of the other hamstrings can also do flexion at the knee, but not all of them. Okay, not all of them. Adductor magnus is one of them that will not do that. Adductor magnus does not cross the knee joint. Okay, does not cross the knee joint. So the adductor magnus hamstring part is the part that we're going to be talking about here. Okay, the other part would be the adductor part that lives in the medial compartment of the thigh along with the other hip adductors. Okay, ADD. Adductors. Okay, right. So adductor magnus hamstring part. This is going to, so another thing we did here is we have all the attachments for both parts. Okay, this is all the attachments for both parts, but I specifically underlined the origin for the hamstring part. Okay, so these attachment sites that are underlined right here are for the hamstring part specifically. Okay, so the whole adductor magnus as a whole muscle is attaching to the inferior pubic ramus, which is right here. It's attaching to the ischial ramus, which is this part of bone right here. Okay, so the inferior pubic ramus, just for your own clarification, the inferior pubic ramus, this whole piece of bone right here is technically, we call it two different things. We call it the inferior pubic ramus here, But here we call it the ischioramus, okay? Because embryologically speaking, these two pieces of bone come from two completely separate bones, okay? Again, review the Inominate bone video so you can get more details on that. So this is the inferior pubic ramus, ischioramus. The adductor magnus is attaching to this whole piece of bone right here, and then also attached to the ischiotuberosity. So it's essentially covering up all this real estate over here, okay? It's taking all this up, all right? And then from there, it's going to run to attach onto, it has some fibers that will reach the gluteal tuberosity. Most of it is attaching onto the linea aspera and also to the medial supracondylar line, okay? So this linea aspera is going to split itself into a medial supracondylar line and a lateral supracondylar line, okay? So it's going to attach to this medial supracondylar line, and then in addition to that, it's going to attach to a small part right here that is like a small bump, okay, that you would feel on a femur that is sitting directly superior to that medial condyle, and we call this the adductor tubercle, okay, because it's a tubercle that serves as an attachment site specifically for the adductor magnus, okay. So out of all of these attachment sites, let's put it in so you can see. So when we're looking at this, one of the things I want to point out is that there's a small opening in the muscle right here, okay? Because it's attaching to the linea aspera and it's coming down, attaching onto that medial supracondylar line. But then right here, there's a part where it is not attaching to the femur. It is not attaching to the femur. And then there's going to be instead what you're going to see when you study the muscle fiber orientation, you're going to see the fibers from the ischiotuberosity running straight down like this. Okay, let me put a line over here so you can kind of visualize it. They're running straight down like that, okay? Whereas the other fibers that are going to be forming the adductor part of the adductor magnus are going to have more of a horizontal orientation like so, okay? But this hamstring part is going to go straight down. It's going to form this tendon that's going to attach to the adductor tubercle, okay? So this portion of the muscle here that goes from ischiotuberosity to adductor tubercle, that's the one that's acting mostly as a hamstring, whereas the rest of it that's attaching to this linea aspera, that's the part that's acting more as an adductor, okay? Good. So that's the adductor magnus. Now, before I go to the next muscle, this thing right here it's there for a reason. Okay, anytime we have spaces, holes formed in the human body, it's there to transmit something. Okay, so this right here is known as the adductor hiatus. The adductor hiatus. Okay, and this is going to serve as a conduit to transmit vascular and nervous structures, from the anterior thigh to the popliteal fossa. So remember, this is three-dimensional. So anterior would be into the screen, right, on the other side. So you're going to have a huge artery on the anterior thigh called the femoral artery that's going to travel down, and it's going to end up sitting in this little pocket known as the adductor canal. You can think of the adductor canal as a tunnel, and then this hiatus as the opening at the end of the tunnel. Okay, so the femoral artery and vein are going to travel through that canal, and then they're going to go through here to then end up back here in the popliteal fossa. And at that point, we'll call them the popliteal artery and vein. Okay, and you can, if you really palpate deep into the back of your knee, you may be able to feel the pulse of that popliteal artery, and that came through this opening. Okay, that's how it ended up back here to then travel down the rest of the posterior leg. Okay. All right. Next, we have the biceps femoris. Okay, the biceps femoris. One thing I want to point out, I didn't mention. So I have these ghosted muscles right here. These are muscles from the anterior thigh that are coming all the way around to attach to this linea aspera. We're going to see these muscles in a later video. This is your vastus lateralis and vastus medialis. I just wanted you to appreciate the fact that there are anterior muscles that wrap around the femur and attach to this linea aspera also. Just nailing home the fact that the linea aspera is a huge attachment site for many muscles. Okay, many muscles. All right, biceps femoris. So biceps femoris is the first muscle out of the hamstrings per se, right? Because the adductor magnus, as we said, was kind of like in this weird category where it's a little bit of both adductor and hamstring. But this is the first hamstring in its full glory. So the biceps femoris, along with many of the other hamstrings, all right, or should I say pretty much all of them, is attaching to the ischial tuberosity, okay? It's also, so look, it's biceps, so it's going to have two heads to it. So the long head is going to attach to the ischial tuberosity. The short head is attaching to the linea aspera. Both heads will come together to insert onto the fibular head. So what's that going to look like? That's going to look like this. Okay, long head here, short head here. They both join together, attach onto the fibular head. Okay, so because of its attachment to the ischial tuberosity, this long head has the ability to produce extension at the hip. Both muscle heads together are inserting onto the fibular head, so they're crossing posterior to the knee joint, which means that both heads acting together will create flexion at the knee joint. Okay, so we have the long head doing extension at the hip, and then both heads doing flexion at the knee. Okay, beautiful. Next, semimembranosus. Semimembranosus. Again, coming from the ischial tuberosity. Okay, over here I shouldn't have included long head because semimembranosus only has one head. Okay, so ischial tuberosity here, and then from there it's going to run straight down and insert onto the posterior part of the medial tibial condyle. So it's kind of a mouthful, but I had to put that because I had to be very descriptive as to where it's inserting, because us anatomists haven't come up with a specific name for this area. Okay, so we just describe it as it is. It's on the tibia. It's the medial condyle of the tibia. Okay, and it's the posterior part of that medial condyle. So posterior part of medial tibial condyle is the insertion for the semimembranosus, and that's going to look like this. Okay, that's going to look like that. And you can see over here how we're starting to set up this thing where there's going to be some hamstrings that are going to be biased out here to the lateral side, and then you're going to have most of the hamstrings biased over here to the medial side. Okay, let's see the continuation of that pattern. So over here we have the next muscle, semitendinosus, where this one was semimembranosus. This is semitendinosus. Okay, on a cadaver or on any kind of model, it's very easy to see the difference between those two, and we're going to see it here also. So semitendinosus is going to be inserting onto this ischial tuberosity also, okay, along with all the hamstrings, and then it's going to attach to something that is on the anterior, I want to say more like the anteromedial aspect of the tibia. Okay, that's why this arrow is a little bit curved, to show us that it's not attaching directly onto the posterior face of the tibia. It's more on the anterior medial side. Okay, and that specific landmark is known as the pes anserinus. Pes anserinus. For anybody who knows how to speak Latin, this means the goose's foot. Okay, pes means foot. Anserine is, I'm not sure exactly what it means, but I know it refers to goose in this context. So pes anserinus, okay? The pes anserinus. Why would I call it the goose's foot? Where the hell did that come from? So if you look at a goose's foot, it's going to have essentially 3 digits separated by webs. And so there are 3 strap-like muscles that attach to this area that's known as the pes anserinus. One of them is the semitendinosus. Okay, so the 3 of them, I always think of the mnemonic SARGENT, SGT, for S being sartorius, G being gracilis, and T for semitendinosus. Okay, and those are the 3 muscles that are going to attach to the pes anserinus. Each one of those muscles comes from one compartment of the thigh. Remember that the thigh has 3 compartments and 3 compartments only. It has an anterior thigh, a posterior thigh, and a medial thigh. Okay, so each one of those compartments is going to have one of those 3 muscles arising from it. The sartorius is going to come from the anterior compartment to attach onto the pes anserinus. The gracilis is going to come from the medial compartment to attach onto the pes anserinus. And the semitendinosus is going to come from the posterior compartment to attach to the pes anserinus. And all together, we're going to have them go there. And so look how the semitendinosus muscle belly here, but then it very early on turns into this very slender and tough tendon. Okay, that's going to run right here, and that's where it gets its name, semitendinosus, versus semimembranosus, which doesn't have too much of a well-developed tendon such as tendinosus does. Okay, so every time I see this, whenever I see this on a cadaveric specimen, for example, I always liken it to a hot dog and a hot dog bun, right? So the semitendinosus would be the sausage, and the semimembranosus would be the bun on which it sits. Okay. Yep, tell him, girl. All right, so that's it for that. Is there anything else I want to include? No. So I am going to make a future series of videos that are going to be more specifically detailed on nerve and artery flows. But for this one, I just wanted to kind of mention a pattern that's very helpful to know, which is the fact that all of these muscles back here. So what we're going to see in future videos is how the sciatic nerve delves down here, and it basically is traveling between these two sides of the hamstrings, and it's going to be made up of two nerves inside, called the tibial portion of the sciatic nerve and the common fibular portion of the sciatic nerve. All of these muscles back here are innervated by the tibial nerve, except for the short head of biceps femoris, which is innervated by the common fibular portion of the sciatic nerve. Okay. And you could think about it where the biceps femoris short head is an exception for multiple things. One of them is the fact that all of these hamstrings are attaching to the ischiotuberosity except for the short head of biceps femoris. All of these hamstrings are innervated by the tibial nerve except for the short head of biceps femoris. Okay. And another thing to remember in terms of like where these structures are in terms of like lateral versus medial, when I was a student and I was first learning these things and I was on a practical exam, in order for me to remember, I used to have like difficulty like remembering that certain things were medial and other things were lateral. And so with this, for example, what I would do is I would just put my hand behind my knee and flex my knee, and I would feel the tendon of my semitendinosus on the medial side, and that's how I would remember. And from there I realized that, well, on the lateral side is only one muscle and one muscle only, biceps femoris. That's it, right? And its distal attachment makes sense, as attaching to the bone that's on the lateral side of the leg, which is the fibula, right? So that's what I mean about pattern recognition, right? Pattern recognition is going to help you a lot in anatomy, but you just need to kind of like see things multiple times. You need to see them from different angles. You need to talk about them. You need to say the words out loud, and kind of just like turn it over in your head a couple of times. All right, so that's all she wrote for this one, and I'll catch you guys next time. Gross anatomy is one of the most difficult subjects in the world. Luckily, it doesn't have to be. Anatomy is one of those subjects that needs constant verbal and visual repetition in order to get good at. What better way to reinforce this information than with the scientifically validated method of drawing? Neuroscience has shown us that we retain information better when we physically draw it out. That is why the Gross Anatomy Study Strategy Workbook is designed to walk you through all the layers of the musculoskeletal system, allowing you to draw the muscles into place. This is excellent for reinforcing muscle attachments, bony landmarks, muscle names, and actions. This will save you tons of time from mind-numbing tactics such as repetitive flashcards or passively listening to boring lectures. With this strategy, you can actually begin to enjoy studying again and have a much better way to retrieve the information. Order a copy of the Gross Anatomy Study Strategy today at the link below so you can spend less time being stressed and more time being blessed.